First of all, may I introduce myself, Nicholas Upton. I'm chairman of the Bugatti Owners Club, and I'm talking to John Barton, who has recently publicized and published the Twilight Years, 1943 to 1963. As a young man, you obviously expressed a keen interest in mechanical workings of cars, and this led to your employment with Ford and subsequently Fiat. This obviously fired your very, very early skills and experience in restoration, and it led you to an opportunity to restore a Morgan 4.4. This ignited, and I'm curious about this, ignited an interest in French cars, which was your Facile Vega. Then you acquired a Type 37, which really was probably the route you were always going forward, which was a French car of a magical history. Can you explain why you acquired a Bugatti and a Type 37 to start your restoration life off?
Well, there are quite a few mistakes in that.
Well, I tell you what, let's see.
Where shall I start?
Well, I tell you what, let's go forwards with the Type 37. Let's eradicate the mistakes later. That's exactly what my housemaster would have said of me.
Right. I used to see a Type 37 on my way to school. As I was walking to school, I used to see a 37 on a regular basis. And I subsequently came to know the owner, who was Dudley Gagan. And it was unusual at the time because most cars were black. And when they went past, they made a sort of sucking noise because they're all side valves. But this little blue car smelt different and sounded different and looked beautiful. And I had a love of that car. But as a young man, I never actually had a love of cars at all. I was far more interested in steam engines, steam trains. But anyway, eventually, after setting up and running the Facile Vega spares business worldwide in the early 1980s, I was able to acquire bits and pieces. The first part I bought was a steering box from Dudley Gagan, the same Dudley Gagan, that he'd bought new from the factory as a spare for his car, and then discovered that it wasn't for his car, it was for another car. So that was the first bit that I bought. I then built my first 37 around the steering box.
Right.
And in those days, I had absolutely nothing but total 100% assistance, enthusiastic assistance from Hugh Conway.
Right.
He gave me every possible piece of, I could ring him at any time and he would give me an instant response, or I would receive the next day a postcard with a detailed drawing showing me what I should be doing and so on.
Magnificent.
So that's how I got my first 37. I built it.
Right. But then your relationship built up with a German who I've noted down as Rudi De, with 4 Bugattis. So clearly you became involved with him both as a friendship, but also admired his engineering experience. And that developed between the two of you to the point where he subsequently provided to you at a very modest sum, which you've told me the story, which I'd like you to relate, 4 Bugattis.
Yes. I put an advertisement, not with great expectations, but I put an advertisement in the club newsletter saying that I was looking for Type 37 parts. And a few months later, I received a reply from Mr. Rudy Dirks in Michigan. And I bought from him for a very small sum some new original steering parts and bits and pieces that he'd bought from Molsheim.
Right.
In the 50s and early 60s. And we never met, but we spoke often on the phone, and he used to write to me a lot. My father having been on the other side, as it were, during the last war, and Rudy, having been a Luftwaffe ground mechanic
Right.
on the Russian front,
Well, yeah.
he used to make some wonderful comments, which
Right.
I have in his letters. He says, you know, I could tell you things about Herr Adolf that would make your hair stand on end.
I can
Anyway, he wrote to me one day and sent me a list of Bugatti spares, and he asked me to value them,
Right.
which I did. The only item I didn't value was the back axle, because I needed one myself and I didn't want to make a valuation for that. So I valued all these parts and sent it to him. And it came to quite a lot of money, probably £40,000 at the time. I mean, there were 4 cars in bits.
Yes, indeed.
So, even at the prices that I gave him, it was quite a lot of money. Anyway, he rang me up one day and he said, look, John, I'd like you to have my cars. And I laughed and I said, well, you know, that's very kind of you, but I'm just a mechanic. And, you know, there's no possible way I could afford to buy your cars.
No.
Even if you knock all the zeros off.
No.
And he said, well, I want $11,762.
How Germanic and precise.
And that came out at £7,200 at the time. And I went straight down to my bank manager and I explained all this to him, and he couldn't believe it either. And so Barclays Bank very kindly provided me with the money to get started with this project. And I've often wondered about the $11,762. Either he'd just had a bill delivered to him that was $11,762, or being a German, a good German, he'd made a list over the years of every penny he'd spent, and that's what it came to, and he wasn't going to add to it.
I think the latter part of that story has to be the element I would go with. So that really enabled you to subsequently build up a collection of work covering both 35s up to the 57s, which was, and you restored some 30 plus Bugattis. And
I've built or worked on 30 Bugattis.
Yes.
Not all of them original, of course. I think I've only worked on one Type 57. We did a hydraulic brake conversion for someone, and I've only put a spanner on 2 Brescias, but almost all the others in between I've had something to do with at one time or another.
How astounding. But the question then leads on, and the comment I put, but why prototypes as they stand alone without real credit from many aficionados, without any real solid history, the pre-39 we know, without development, and commercially without real value?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Bugattis. I have a passion for prototypes. I'd very much like a 4-cylinder XK Jaguar engine, which they did build, and which Sir William Lyons pulled the rug out because he said he could hear the timing chain. Apparently it had a noisy timing chain, and so he would not make the 4-cylinder XK engine, which I think might have been an XJ engine, but it was a 4-cylinder version of the XK engine, and he refused to make it because it was not up to his standards of silence.
Right.
I'd love one of those. There's all sorts of prototypes I'd like to own, but never will. So yeah, I was delighted to be able to have a look at the Bugatti prototypes.
Clearly. So with Bugatti himself, with the problems that they were having in France that particular time with worker strikes, the real distance from Paris, where he was enjoying a very social part of his life with entertainment, his cars, an element of wealth, and the lifestyle that one would have in Paris that particular time, the detriment to the high value of saloons, which was clearly cutting into his turnover or profitability. However, with the war intervening and the opportunity of receiving a substantial cash sum from the Germans who were then taking over Paris. Do you think that actually lit a light in Bugatti's lifestyle, that he thought he could now sketch and draw, and really the creative elements, even the one you've shown me this morning of the roof tile? That's where his real talent came from, not running a factory, not operating a day-to-day business.
Yes, I think there's an element of truth in that. The Germans gave him a massive sum of money, and not only that, but they took the workforce as well. And after the workforce had locked him out of the factory, he didn't really have much love for them.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. So then we get to the Type 73 racing car. So I moved on a little bit within your book, which you drove at Prescott. And now we see Tom Dart driving the 73C004.
5.
I beg your pardon, 5. And of course, we saw it running at Goodwood 10 days ago.
Yes, Tom's pretty quick, isn't he?
He's a good pilot.
Not quick enough, though. He should have won that.
I will. Well, he'll see this, so he'll note suitably. So this leads you really to explore the 251, which is really, I put down, the drawings are an absolute dream. They have a rhythm of Mercedes. They have little tickles of a Maserati 250, even, dare I say, Raymond May's view of a BRM, and an amalgam of emerging Grand Prix car. Explain the involvement to me, please, of Colombo and his obvious substantial influence in the drawing and the concept behind his car.
I am fairly certain that the 251 did not start out as a Bugatti.
Right.
Colombo, as you can see from his letter heading in the personal letters that I published, had a design studio in Italy. And I believe he designed that car. If you looked at the quote in front of at the head of the 251 chapter, you'll see that he was thinking about a rear-engined car.
Correct.
Having seen the auto unions, of course, and just been blown away, as everybody else was, he thought that perhaps he could do just as well, and offered a rear engine designed to Ferrari in 1938 or something, or 39. And Ferrari said, no, we always put the horse before the cart, his famous expression. And I think in the early 50s, 1953, when Colombo drew up that design, it didn't have Bugatti name on it at that time. It could have been a Ferrari, it could have been a Maserati, it could have been an Alfa. It just happened that Roland Bugatti sought out his assistants, or maybe, I don't even know, and I don't know if anybody else knows, whether he went to Roland and offered it to him, or whether Roland went to him and said, can you design us a Grand Prix car? In which case he would have said, yes, I've got one here in my briefcase.
Absolutely right. Just so, yes. How interesting. So when it was developed, the notes that you have clearly made upon testing by pre-war the drivers were fascinating. Reims was chosen as the entrance to the racing world, but that wasn't altogether successful, was it?
No, it was a disaster from start to finish. And if you look at the documents from the factory, you'll see that Marco, the factory manager, in one of his documents that is sent out to several recipients in the factory, he says that if there are any questions that have to be answered about ordering parts or whatever, then they have to go to Mr. Colombo, and if he's not there, they have to go to Monsieur Rudolph, and if he's not there, then they come to me, Mr. Marco. But then a few months later, there's a subtle change, and there's another document sent out to these recipients in the factory. And he says, I need to remind you all that the boss of the racing department is Mr. Roland Bugatti, and any questions have to go to him. So what Marco was doing was washing his hands of it and passing the baby to Roland, so that when it was a disaster, which he knew it was going to be, because they weren't ready, it would be Roland who would be taking the blame and not him.
Mm-hmm. A very corporate attitude to take, really. How disappointing. In looking at, when Colombo produced two engines, or I beg your pardon, there were two designs, both for the 1500 and the 4 litre, to fit in with the Grand Prix regulations.
Let me just stop you there.
Correct me.
The Grand Prix formula at that time was 2.5 litres, and the 251 is 2.5 litres.
Correct.
Not 4 litres.
Beg your pardon. Dennis Jenks made a copy, a note in Motorsport, which I thought was very harsh, but then Jenks was very harsh, both for praise and criticism. I met him several times, so I met his tongue both to be lashed and to be appraised, or praised, occasionally. Anyway, the comment that he made was, foolish to expect too much from such a revolutionary approach to Grand Prix design. I think that was a little cruel, but the reality of that, would more money, more expertise and involvement have really pushed this machine to be a Grand Prix competitor?
I think the answer to that is on page 287 or 288 of my book. On the left, you've got a letter in French from Colombo to Mr. Woodruff, and on the right, you've got the English translation,
yes,
done by my good friend, James Ayres, retired British diplomat. So it's fairly accurate translation. And he's writing to his second in command back at Molsheim, because Colombo used to travel backwards and forwards. He'd go to Molsheim for a few days, and then he'd go back to Italy, and then he'd go over to Molsheim, and so on. And while he wasn't there, Mr. Woodruff was in charge. Now, he is an extremely well-respected man. He became a professor at Strasbourg at the university, and he was a metallurgist and an extremely good and well-respected. And he was Colombo's second in command. And they became very good friends. And in fact, they stayed good friends right until the mid-60s. And Colombo used to write to him, and he'd give him advice and support and moral support. And in that letter on page 287, I think it is, you'll see that he's saying to Mr. Woodruff, look, you have to get along with this man. And if not, you have to at least get along with Mr. Marco. Yes. So what he's really saying is you have to get along with Roland Bugatti. And obviously he wasn't getting along with him.
Not at all, not at all.
And the inference, I mean, I haven't put my own interpretation of that into the book. There is an old Latin expression concerning speaking ill of the dead,
yes,
which I think I agree with. I haven't really said very much about that. I've left people to read between the lines, but that particular letter tells you everything. The engine, when first tested, gave 260 horsepower. And if you read all of the histories about the 251, you'll say that it was heavy and underpowered. Well, 260 horsepower for an unblown 2.5 litre at the time was not bad.
Absolutely.
And that was the first test.
Yes.
So a proper development program following that first test, driven by the chief designer, Colombo, who had the experience from the 250F and the Alfetta and everything else that he'd done, one might assume that he would have pushed that horsepower up.
Yes, indeed.
At some point, though, Roland took over. It's quite obvious that, I mean, he started interfering at the beginning because the drawing on which I put on the cover of the book for that very reason, the drawing of the 251 shows independent front suspension, which is how Colombo designed it. And it was Roland that said, no, it's not a Bugatti. It must have a beam front axle. And Colombo thought he was joking. But he had to go back to Italy and do what Roland wanted and fit a beam front axle, which was a nonsense at the time. I've lost the thread of what I was going to say.
No, you haven't at all. The documents that you have put together within the book, which I find fascinating, even to the color of the letter on the left-hand side, which is normally in French in your book, and on the translation on the right-hand side, hence by your diplomatic friend, gives a feeling of continuation throughout the whole book. I mean, clearly it's a wonderful record. You must have had huge fun putting together the intricacies of this jigsaw. I mean, I know there would have been days of frustration, but
do you see
we've both got grey hair.
Do you see this?
You still have hair. That's fine. That's fine. So, putting together the cast of the characters involved, the photographs, the drawings, the correspondence, the patterns. What a wealth of information you have given to Bugatti, interested parties, and the greater public per se. I mean, from my own point of view, I've thoroughly enjoyed it reading, and I will utilize it in little bits of commentary. Let me wish you huge success in this publication.